participation involved in this story, because this is a story about the connection between our breath and our spirit. So I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to just take a moment to breathe, to inhale and exhale. We don't really get time to focus on that in our busy lives. And think about your breath as I tell you this story entitled Qi, the breath of life. My dad's name was Kurt, and Kurt was 19 years old when he discovered he had tuberculosis. He was living under Japanese occupation in wartime Shanghai. The year was 1943. This is the way he described it in his own words. I woke up one morning and I started spitting up blood. There were a lot of illnesses there and stomach problems, so at first we didn't know if the blood was coming from my stomach or somewhere else. His family gathered around him, his mother, father, uncle, and younger sister, and he felt kind of embarrassed for creating a fuss, but everybody wanted to know what was going on. He looked at his mother's face. Her hair was beginning to turn gray, and her apron was threadbare. And he looked at his father's face, which was deeply lined, and his father had become so skinny from years of malnutrition. Now you might ask, what was a nice Jewish boy doing in a place like this? Well, last season at Stories on Friday, we shared 3 stories about my father Kurt and his family, beginning with their escape from their hometown of Halle, Germany, which was in the news this week for the synagogue shooting. They escaped from there to get away from Nazi persecution, and the only port of refuge for Jewish refugees in 1939 was Shanghai. So they arrived in Shanghai via steamship in 1939 with no money, no connections, and one valuable possession in their luggage, which was young Kurt's stamp collection. They arrived in Shanghai in the summer of 1939. He was 15 years old. They disembarked from their steamship to an underfunded and overcrowded refugee camp in a war-torn district of Shanghai known as Hongqiu. And Kurt described their existence in the camp with one word. It was miserable. But within a few months, they had made some connections. They were able to find work and education and food and housing at a missionary school, also located in Hongqiu. And so they made a decent existence for themselves for a few years. And in this, they were in common with most of the 20,000 Jewish refugees who were in Shanghai in those years. Most of them managed to assemble some kind of new life for themselves out of whatever they had available. Now, the Chinese have a word for the building blocks of life. It's known as Qi. It's spelled Qi. It's a very good word to know if you play Scrabble. Qi translates literally as breath, and it translates figuratively as spirit, or in Chinese thinking, the life force within all of us. And the thinking is that where Qi assembles, life exists. The spirit that energized the Shanghai Jews was maybe breath, maybe spirit, but more than that, it was their state of mind. They were all grateful to have escaped Nazi persecution and to not be in Europe. And they were optimistic that the war would end someday and they would be liberated, and then they would have a good life. But that breath of hope became a collective gasp in December of 1941. That's when the Japanese had their raid on Pearl Harbor. And the next day in Shanghai, a complete invasion took over. The Japanese Imperial Army poured into Shanghai, set up military checkpoints, made people wear armbands. They confiscated homes and businesses. seized farms and food supplies, and they terrorized the local population. If you've read or seen J.G. Ballard's Empire of the Sun, you've seen what was done to the non-Jewish European colonists in Shanghai. They were interned in 6 different internment camps, and most of that happened in about 1942. And the Japanese left the Jewish refugees alone for quite a while, but they were under pressure from their Nazi allies to do something negative to the Jews. So in 1943, the Japanese Imperial Army issued a proclamation with a capital P and pasted it up on the walls and in the newspapers in Shanghai. And what the proclamation did was relocate and confine the 20,000 Shanghai Jews to a 1 square mile of Hangzhou, and it was to be moved into alongside the existing 100,000 Chinese inhabitants of Hangzhou. So in May of 1943, Kurt and his mother and sister and father and uncle moved into a row house in Hangzhou with 3 other families. They shared 1 kitchen. Their toilet was a bucket that was put out in the morning for collection every day. This is what everyone had to do. There was no sanitation. People's clothes became shabby from years of wear without replacement. Sugar and soap were so scarce that they were sold in even smaller containers than Judy talked about. They were purchased in half-ounce quantities. Food was also scarce, so people were becoming afflicted with anemia and malnutrition. There was also a complete lack of clean water. There were also lice, and there was tremendous overcrowding, so all kinds of infectious diseases developed. And where qi disassembles, life dies. The summers were so hot in Shanghai that one summer 16 people collapsed from heat right on the street in the district. And in the winters it was cold and damp and there was no heat, and many people simply couldn't afford blankets to keep them warm. So this is how it went on. And despite that, Kurt was fortunate. He was able to find work outside the district. He landed a job as an apprentice furrier at one of the top fur makers in downtown Shanghai on a very fancy shopping street called Nanking Road. Now, the only problem was, if you wanted to work outside the district, you had to get a work permit, and you had to go see a man named Mr. Goya. Mr. Goya was the Japanese military officer who was primarily charged with enforcing all the restrictions and constraints of the district. And if you read historical accounts about wartime Shanghai, they all feature Mr. Goya, and they all say the same thing. He was cruel, he was tyrannical, and he was ill-tempered. He was also short, so he was famous for standing on his desk so he could yell at people and slap them. And he gave himself the name King of the Jews and enjoyed having himself photographed in front of the long lines of people who were waiting to get work permits. But Kurt stood in line, and he didn't get slapped, and he did get his work permit. So after that, every day he took the streetcar to Nanking Road, did his work at the furrier shop, sewing fur coats, took the streetcar back, and gave whatever money he earned to his mother to buy some food. And the war dragged on, and he did this day after day until he woke up one morning and he was coughing up blood. The examining doctor in the camp determined that Kurt had tuberculosis in his right lung. And there was no treatment, no pharmaceutical treatment for tuberculosis at the time. It was treated with a procedure called an induced pneumothorax. And that's with a P, as in pneumonia or pneumatic. Now, if you know what a pneumothorax is, it's the medical term for collapsed lung. So the procedure was to deliberately collapse the person's lung because it had a cavity in it where the blood was coming from. And they had been successful in halting the progression of the disease by injecting air into people's lung cavity and compressing the lung. Not very pleasant, but there was no other alternative. Now, a pneumothorax couldn't be done in Hangzhou. You needed to go to a proper hospital. And there was one in Shanghai where it could be done, but it required a 3-day stay in hospital, and the hospital was in the French sector of the international settlement. It was not going to be free. It was going to cost money. In Chinese thinking, there are actually two kinds of qi. There's heavenly qi, which we take in by breathing, and there's earthly qi, which we take in by eating. Well, Kurt was running out of both air and food, and now he needed money. So there was really only one thing left to do. You may remember I mentioned a stamp collection that they brought from Germany. He took out the stamp collection. He'd been hiding it in Shanghai for 4 years, protecting it from heat and humidity and theft and damage. He got out the stamp collection and he sold off not all of it, but enough of it to pay for his hospitalization in the French sector. And then he made an appointment. His family couldn't come with him, and they couldn't visit him in hospital because it was outside the district and none of them had a permit. So he went by himself and he had this procedure, which he described to me later in life in great detail because it was done under local anesthetic. So he was awake and attentive, and he was a curious 19-year-old guy. So I think to some extent he found it interesting, and he had no place else to put his attention. So what they did, they had a contraption. The first part of the contraption was a long hollow needle that they insert between the ribs. And it has to be done by a doctor who has a very delicate hand, because the needle has to go in just past the pleura that protects the lung, but not actually go into the lung tissue. Now that's a hollow needle, and it has a little air hole at the end, and it's connected by a tube to a cylinder that has air, which is connected by another tube to a cylinder that has water. So they held both of these cylinders up over his head, and they held the water cylinder up higher, and the water flows through tubing into the air cylinder, and it pushed the air out of the next tubing into the hollow needle and into his lung. So that was the pneumothorax, and it seemed to be successful. And then he had 3 days in the hospital with maybe a little bit too much time to think. So in his short life, he had faced a lot of challenges. He had experienced anti-Semitism, displacement, poverty, and hunger. And he had witnessed oppression and violence and death and all kinds of mayhem. But tuberculosis was different. All of those other antagonists were external. This one was going to be consuming him from the inside. Up until then, he'd been buoyed by the hope that by the time the war ended, which surely it would, he'd still be a young man. He'd be healthy and strong and energetic. He might even get to emigrate to America. He'd learn a career. He'd marry. He'd have a family. He was young. He was going to have a normal life someday. But now it didn't look that way. All of his aspirations were as collapsed as his lung. Life seemed kind of pointless. And as he lay there and his thoughts continued, he thought about his family. His sister was 15, or about to turn 15, and he thought about, well, what was it going to be like for her on the streets of Shanghai in the middle of a war without a big brother to guide her and protect her? And then he thought about how ill his father was and unable to work, and what was his mother going to do for money? She was going to run out of money to buy food pretty soon. And then he realized, even though the future was kind of fuzzy, the present was clear. His family needed him, and he needed them. And that was motivation enough to rest, recover, regain his strength, and hopefully return to work. And he felt his chi beginning to reassemble. Now, I'm going to come back in November and tell the next installment of this story. But this experience was a turning point in my father's life, and I want to share a couple more things with you. The first is that pneuma, with a P, as in pneumothorax, is a Greek word, and it happens to have the very same meaning as the Chinese word qi. It means both breath and spirit. And I find grace in that, and that feeds my spirit. And I would like to put a question to all of you. You don't have to raise your hands, just to think about. What is it that feeds your spirit? What is your qi? There is something in your life that lights a spark within you that helps you to overcome the challenges that life throws at you. And for every one of us in the room, the answer may be different. It may be family, as it was for my father, or it may be any number of other things. Most of all, when I think about my father's resilience, I think about that turning point in his life where he realized that there was a common interest that was maybe more fundamental and more important than his own personal problems. And I know that that's how he lived his life as my father, as the person I knew. So for Kurt, the idea that there are larger things in this world, more important than our own fate, was his breath of air. It was a defining characteristic, and I think it was a quality not just of him, but of many people in his generation. And because of them, and because of that quality that they had, all of us are still here, breathing, 80 years after the beginning of World War II.